We find ourselves in the northern part of Oregon, alongside the Columbia River in the town of Hood River. An autumn day greets us as the rain descends on a collection of coaches belonging to the Mount Hood Railroad, who calls this riverside community home. These long-serving coaches are part of an ongoing survival story of this scenic line. With a rich history founded in the pursuit of lumber, we will look at what began and what has become one of Oregon's most iconic shortlines. Once known as the Apple Belt Line, these 22 miles of rail traverse southward from the town of Hood River and its connection with the Union Pacific. Utilizing a canyon created by the town's namesake, it climbs up into the Hood River Valley via a switchback and onwards through the localities of Pine Grove, Odell, and Dee, where it arrives at the line's terminus of Parkdale, near the base of Mount Hood. The Mount Hood branch stands out in Oregon not only in regards to the surrounding scenery, but also on the ground that its route has changed very little since its completion. Many lines will lose sections to natural disasters or have sections of it removed and abandoned, but as the line stands today from Hood River to Parkdale, it still follows the same route laid down over 100 years ago. Then standing high above it all at 11,249 feet, Mount Hood makes its presence known as it dominates the skyline. One of Oregon's most notable landmarks, Mount Hood can be seen from miles around, which not only creates a stunning backdrop, attracting many to this region, but also is where our line derives its name. In Part 1, we will journey south following the Hood River and paralleling Highway 35 to the town of Odell. Along this stretch of track, we will see tight curves and steep grades along with many of the industries that grew with the arrival of the railroad. Our journey begins in the town of Hood River, where the first settlement of note appeared here in the 1860s, with the first post office built in 1868, which at first was named Dog River, before later changed to Hood River, with the town itself incorporated in 1895. At first, it was part of Wasco County before the formation of the Hood River County in 1908, whereby the town would become the county seat. Its location next to the Columbia River and proximity to the Cascade Mountains has allowed Hood River to market itself as the perfect getaway destination. Patrons come for the world-class windsurfing on the Columbia River, hiking trails into the mountain wilderness, and the county's numerous vineyards and breweries dotted throughout the Hood River Valley. The railroad would arrive in Hood River in 1882 as the Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company built eastward from Portland, building the first depot here and giving the town a prime connection with the rest of the nation. Today, this major thoroughfare still does what it was built to do in taking products to and from the Midwest to ports on the West Coast, though the trains today are somewhat heavier and most certainly longer. Standing next to the main line it once served, the depot we see today was originally built by the then-named Oregon and Washington Railroad Navigation Company, a subsidiary of the Union Pacific, in 1911 to replace the original depot that was soon outgrown. The depot would see its last mainline passenger service in 1997 with the end of Amtrak's Pioneer service, but today it still serves its purpose as intended, being the home of the Mount Hood Railroad, whose headquarters are in the depot itself. When the Mount Hood Railroad built their branch, they constructed their own depot a stone's throw away that was served by a short spur coming off the branch line. Union Pacific would end up purchasing the Mount Hood branch in 1968, which ended the need for a second depot, bringing about its removal, with services using the Union Pacific's depot from then on. A photo from just before its removal shows the depot in good condition, along with a couple other buildings in the background. The furthest back was the original engine shed, which has since been removed. In the middle was the Pacific Fruit Express office, which still stands today next to the car park. A little further in present day and we find the railroad's workshop, where the company's locomotives and coaches are maintained, as well as storage tracks for the railroad's coach fleet and cars for the line's sole customer, Mount Hood Forest Products, who we will see later on. As an interesting side story, the east side of the surviving Union Pacific depot had some remodeling done to it by one of the Mount Hood Railroad locomotives that had failed to stop in time, instead arriving in Union Pacific's adjacent depot. Returning to the rain, we see the Mount Hood crew with locomotive number 2250 having just returned from dropping off loaded center beams in the interchange tracks just beyond the depot. They have returned with empties along with their caboose for the next trip to the lumber reload in Odell tomorrow morning. Until then, they will be tied down in the siding adjacent to the main track. After tying down the empties, the crew will hook on to the iconic passenger cars that the line is known for, and prepare for the first of several excursion trains for today. The Mount Hood Railroad has a fleet of 15 passenger coaches, all in different states of operational order, and can be seen stored between the depot and the railroad's workshop. Their heritage is quite varied, with some having seen service on the Union Pacific, Army hospital trains, and even Alaskan rails. Some were part of the Spirit of Oregon dinner train that ran on the Port of Tillamook Bay Railroad. Most are named after natural landmarks or notable figures to the area, such as Lewis and Clark, Multnomah Falls, Wakena Falls, Oneida Falls, Bridal Veil Falls, Mount Adams, Timberline, Hood River, Mount Hood, and Y East, which is the Native American name for Mount Hood. Poised in front of the depot, 2250 idles with its train awaiting the next group of passengers to board. In front of the power, we can see the connection with the Union Pacific Main Line, and beyond that, the transfer sidings, which we will see more of later on. 2250 started life as St. Louis and Southwestern Railroad, GP 35 number 771. It would later see many years of service as part of Omnitracks, where it would be rebuilt as a GP 38-3. 2250 would spend a couple years on the Mount Hood Railroad as a lease unit after the line's previous owner went into receivership. The railroad's two long-standing locomotives, number 2 and number 88, were sold off, leaving the new owners in need of motive power. The railroad would receive the 2250 from Western Rail Services in July of 2020. As we wait for the passengers to board, let us take a detour and delve into the history that would bring about the Mount Hood Railroad. Hood River's economy has been driven from its early beginnings by its placement on the banks of the Columbia River, providing a gathering point for all the produce grown in the Hood River Valley. With the advent of the railroad, this would only increase its importance as an economic hub for the region. Distillers, fruit packers, canneries, and feed supplies would all be served by the Union Pacific and its predecessors next to their main line. And despite the large presence of agriculture in the region, it was lumber that would be the driving force in our story. The story begins with the Oregon Lumber Company, owned by David Eccles, who would build mills around Hood River in the 1880s, before deciding to shift focus to the Washington side of the Columbia River. After this, Captain P.S. Davidson would fill the void being left behind, incorporating the Lost Lake Lumber Company in 1898, building a mill on the south bank of the Columbia River just to the east of Hood River itself. Today, the mill's location is where the Hood River Bridge, built in 1924, crosses the Columbia River. Spanning nearly 1 mile, the bridge connects the communities of White Salmon and Bingen in Washington state. The Lost Lake Lumber Company, however, was destined to fail from the beginning, due to one problem that would prove the company's undoing. This was how to get the logs from the logging claim, some 30 miles away on the side of Mount Hood, to the mill site by the Columbia River. A plan was formed to float the logs down the Hood River to its confluence with the Columbia River. But water claims and the unpredictability of the water flow put an end to these plans. Davidson attempted to keep the company going by borrowing money from the aforementioned David Eccles. But failing to raise the needed revenue, he defaulted on the debt and Eccles acquired the Lost Lake Lumber Company in 1903. Then in the following year, it would be reorganized under the Oregon Lumber Company, who proceeded to attempt to make Davidson's plan work for floating logs down the river, but to no avail. Instead, plans were made to build a dam a mile upriver from the mill to act as a catchment point. Before the Oregon Lumber Company could act, though, 3 local businessmen secured a 99-year lease on the proposed site with their own plans to build a reservoir, stating that they would willingly hold the Oregon Lumber Company's logs in it for them. Possibly spurred on by this move, Eccles dropped his plan for the dam a few weeks later and announced that he would instead move the mill from its current location on the banks of the Columbia 16 miles south and build a railroad to connect it to the then Oregon Railroad and Navigation Company's main line. Thus, the Mount Hood Railroad was born. Returning back to the depot, everyone is now aboard and the crew is ready to shove their train out of Hood River. Our train passes by the company's workshops, while in the background, a trash train heads east up the Columbia River Gorge to Arlington. Making its way south, the line crosses under the route of Highway 30 and negotiates a tight curve above the river on an engineered embankment. At the other end of this curve, the railroad crosses over the Hood River on the first of only 2 river crossings on our way to Parkdale. A steel truss spans the Hood River, sporting a build date of 1906, the same year the Mount Hood Railroad was incorporated. However, this is not the original bridge for this site, but rather a replacement brought in from elsewhere, most likely by the later owners of the line, Union Pacific. Next to the bridge stands another significant structure, which at first may seem very out of place at the bottom of the river's gorge. In fact, this was once a hydroelectric generator plant that supplied the power for the town of Hood River, known as Powerdale. Finished in 1923, this facility would be in operation until 1926, after major flooding of the Hood River severely damaged the key components of the facility, as well as the railroad. Besides the gantry and powerhouse that we see today, there was also a maintenance garage and a tall surge tower that dominated the site, as seen here in this image taken in the 1930s. These were removed in 2010 as part of a program to return the river back to its natural course, along with other features that we will see further upriver. Note in the bottom right corner of the image, the timber-worn through truss over the Hood River for the railroad. This was the predecessor to the steel truss we see today. The autumn colors are in full show as we follow the train making its way south along the river. The grade out of Hood River is very minimal for the first couple of miles. A walking trail follows the line from Powerdale, laid on the former path of the pipeline that once carried the water to the powerhouse. Some of the concrete bases that held the pipe remain in the ground, paralleling the railroad. About a mile from Powerdale, the walking path and the railroad diverge, with the path crossing the river on the last remaining section of pipeline that bridges over the rushing water below. The pipeline once carried water from the dam a couple of miles upstream, known as Copper Dam, which was removed as part of the river's reconstruction in 2010, with no traces left. The public can now walk atop the remaining section of pipeline, starting from here for a little under a mile upstream. Originally made of wood, these surviving steel pipe sections are a unique part of Hood River's industrious past and a pursuit to harness the energy of the Hood River itself. Returning trackside, and we catch 2250 heading north through the S-curves located near the pipeline bridge. The Mount Hood Railroad would be incorporated on February 23, 1905 by Eccles and Associates as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Oregon Lumber Company, with groundwork starting in April of the same year. Work crews were brought over from the company's other line, the Sumter Valley Railroad, including Japanese immigrants working the beet fields also owned by David Eccles near La Grande. The new mill site, now called D, was reached in March of the following year, with services beginning in May of 1906. After traveling 2 miles, our train passes a location known as Hogg's Crossing. As the train approaches the grade crossing, we can clearly see the windows on either side of the coach's gangway. This not only gives passengers a unique view of the line as the train makes its way south, but more importantly, this also allows the conductor to see the track ahead. For this portion of the run, the conductor will ride the rear of the train, communicating with the engineer as they go. Roughly 2.5 miles into our journey, here the line begins the climb towards what is possibly the line's most notable feature, the switchback, one of only 4 standard gauge switchbacks still in active use in the continental U.S. Standing on the middle section of the switchback, we can clearly see the 2 parts of the line converging. The line to the left being that from Hood River, and the line to the right being the continuation onwards to Parkdale. Our train rises up the incline as it enters the switchback. As we have seen thus far, our train has shoved all the way from Hood River. The switchback is the reason for this style of operation on the Mount Hood Railroad, which has been in place since services began over 100 years ago, earning the line its nickname of the Backwards Railroad. the switch now lined for Pine Grove, the engineer throttles up for the grade as they proceed further south. The locomotive is now on the head end of the train and in a better position for tackling the tight, steep climb to come. Only possible if the train is reversed from Hood River to here. The grade is very clear on each line even without the compression of the camera lens. Reaching 3.4% at its steepest point, this is not only the steepest grade on the line, but also the steepest active grade in Oregon. Looking down from halfway up the main grade, 2250 steadily advances upward. Now standing further back, we get a side-on impression of the steep grade as the line rises above and crosses over Highway 35. Here the engineer slows his train as it begins to negotiate the tight 14-degree curve and steep camber. Half a mile further south, 2250 takes its train beneath Pass Drive as it continues its climb to the floor of the lower Hood River Valley. Standing just south of Mason Road, we see Mount Adams looming large north of us from Washington State as we await today's train on a summer's day. When initial plans for the railroad's path were drawn, the route was to continue to parallel the Hood River around the western side of the Hood River Valley towards the lumber mill site at D, being the most direct and cheapest route. However, this would mean the line would bypass all the orchards and associated towns, which could provide additional revenue for the railroad. As such, it was decided to build the line on the eastern side of the valley, resulting in the need for the switchback and its steep grades to raise the line from the river's edge to the valley floor. As the power rounds the curve, we find one of the railroad's newest acquisitions, number 1639, in charge, followed by a custom generator car. The grade is still very evident here as 1639 nears the top of the incline. the train clearing the second crossing, we can see Mount Hood in the background. The line crosses over Mason Road twice in close succession. Better seen from above, we can see a spur located here in the space between the two crossings, which once served a local propane dealer and which at one time was the busiest customer on the line. Today, the spur is used as storage by the railroad. When the railroad would arrive at what is now Pine Grove, it was first known as Van Horn, which was the name of the family that owned the surrounding land, including the Van Horn Butte, which at over 100 feet is a distinctive feature on the east side of the line. This landmark was first known as Julia Butte, before the Van Horn brothers acquired the land in 1906, with one of the brothers, Wills, building his house on the peak. Van Horn would appear on maps until the 1970s, when the Union Pacific would take over the operations of the branch, after which the depot here would become known as Pine Grove, supposedly in reference to a group of trees that once stood nearby. Pine Grove was once one of two hubs for produce grown in the valley to be transferred to rail, and is still home to several fruit packing companies which are no longer served by rail, along with the Juanita's Tortilla Factory. Next to the tracks is a large Diamond Fruit Company warehouse that is now owned by the Fruit Company, known for their fruit gift baskets nationwide. On the other side of the tracks is Duckwall Fruit, which along with Diamond Fruit is one of the oldest and biggest fruit packing companies in the valley. The Fruit Company's showroom stands on the site where the Pine Grove Grange once stood, as seen in this image, which shows the Grange as well as the original depot, which we can see was located between the main line and passing track here in Pine Grove. This image is the only one that shows the Mount Hood Railroad's depot, which no longer stands. However, the Grange survives, having been moved across the street, and is still actively used by the community today. After a journey time of 45 minutes, our train arrives in Pine Grove, pulling up alongside the Diamond Fruit Warehouse. As the engineer pulls just short of the crossing, we have a clear view of Mount Adams some 50 miles north in Washington State. At the time of filming, Pine Grove is the limit of the current passenger operations from Hood River by the Mount Hood Railroad. Under new ownership, they are hoping to reopen the line back to Parkdale and resume a full timetable service in the near future. For now, though, our train departs Pine Grove and returns back to Hood River in the same fashion it started, backwards. Looking up from atop Highway 30, 2250 passes the yardboard, nearing the end of another excursion run. With the passengers back in Hood River, we will now take a look at the railroad's freight operations. On an early morning, we are standing atop Highway 30 with a good view of Mount Hood Railroad's small yard in Hood River. We find today's crew warming up the railroad's newest unit, number 4101, in preparation for the day's run to Odell. Once ready, the crew has some work to collect their cars from the interchange. speeder joins the fray as a westbound manifest passes by on the Union Pacific Main. During the week when the passenger excursions are not running, the line remains busy, making a daily run to Odell and back to serve the lumber reload. The Mount Hood Railroad would purchase the 4101 in 2022 from S&S Leasing after seeing many years of service for the Rio Valley Switching Company in southern Texas, and prior to this on the Kiamichi Railroad. Built in 1957 for the Chehaskapee in Ohio, this unit would lose its nose in the 1990s as part of a rebuild. Having now collected their cars from the interchange, the crew brings them into the yard where they will proceed the run around them. Runaround complete, the conductor will walk an air test of the train to ensure all the brake cylinders are working properly before they proceed south. As with the passenger excursions, our train will need to shove its way to the switchback. In order to give the conductor a more comfortable ride, the Mount Hood Railroad has a caboose they use as a shoving platform, continuing a long-held tradition for the line. With the air test complete, the conductor climbs up and the train departs south. Arriving back in Pine Grove, we can see 4101 on the head of the train as it passes through the locality, where before the train turned back here, we will be continuing south. Leaving Pine Grove behind, the line passes under Highway 35. We continue to follow 4101 as it winds through the few short miles to Odell. With a population of over 2,200, the town of Odell sits roughly halfway between Hood River and Parkdale and is home to the county fairgrounds. The town is named after William Odell, who settled in the valley in 1861. The original town center is located about half a mile away from the tracks near the intersection of Odell Highway and Summit Drive. As industries grew near the rail line, the town center moved to where Odell Highway crosses over the tracks today. As in Pine Grove, Odell is host to several industries that were at one time rail-served but have since moved to road transportation or closed down. Around the center of town stands several fruit processing plants which still have their spur tracks feeding from the main line. The largest of these facilities is owned by the Diamond Fruit Growers Incorporated, who have been based out of Hood River since its formation in 1913 as the Apple Growers Association. Earlier in Pine Grove, we saw one of their other facilities. The cooperative would build a new facility here in Odell in the 1970s, where it would continue to expand and become the center of the company's operations. Here they sort pears, apples, and cherries from over 6,000 acres of surrounding orchards, making Odell the center of the fruit-growing industry of the Hood River Valley. In 2001, parent company High Cascade International would acquire a mill site situated a few miles south of Odell, next to Highway 35. They currently produce upwards of 175 million board feet of lumber every year, giving their bundles distinct red ends and Mount Hood stenciled in green on the sides. However, with it being uneconomical for the mill to have a direct spur built from the railroad, a transload site was located here in Odell, and it is where processed lumber from the mill is loaded for shipment by rail. The reload here consists of a through track and a recently added spur track, which can each hold up to 5 cars. Next to the main line is a storage track where cars could be held for the reload. While we await today's crew to arrive, the reload operators are seen unloading inbound trucks from the lumber mill, and in turn placing the loads on the center beams for further shipment. 4101 arrives from Hood River, and the crew's first move is to place the cars in the siding next to the main and proceed to run around them once more. Having run around, the crew will next take their caboose and set it over to the main. With the caboose in position, the conductor lines the switch for the spur track, and the crew heads in to collect the outbound loads. Pulling the 5 loads out, they will be coupled up to the caboose for the return journey and shoved to clear so the crew can spot the empties they brought with them. Having shoved back to clear the crossing, more lumber arrives from the mill. Switching all done, the crew sets off back for Hood River. As they depart, we will take a slight diversion to the east in order to catch a different crew on a different road as they too prepare to head for Hood River from the Dalles, Oregon. The Dalles sits roughly in the middle on Union Pacific's Portland subdivision. It was once a common crew change point. There is still an active yard here that mainly serves the adjacent railroad tie plant and maintenance of way operations. The Dalles Stern is based out of here and operates with a dedicated GP 38-2 number 820. This ex-Missouri Pacific GP unit is fitted with both PTC and cab signals required for its work on the main line. The Turn makes the run to Hood River on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, interchanging cars with the Mountain Hood Railroad, then bringing back the loads to be picked up by trains heading to Portland or sorting at Union Pacific's Albina Yard. Tuesdays and Thursdays, the Turn heads east as far as Boardman to set out cars there. The engineer heads out to the unit and first refreshes the ice in the ever-important cooler before bringing UP 820 into life. With the conductor and switchman now on board, the crew departs for Hood River. We return to Pine Grove once more as the Mount Hood crew rounds the curve, climbing the small grade into town. As the track levels out, the engineer slows the train to allow for the conductor to climb down and set all the retaining valves in preparation for the steep descent down to the switchback. Depending on the setting of these valves, the flow of air can be restricted or held in the brake cylinders, providing greater braking resistance as the train descends. This helps the engineer manage his speed to prevent his train from running away. As the conductor finishes setting up the cars, we can see the beginning of the grade beyond the train as the ground drops away. Having returned to the switchback on a summer's day, we wait in anticipation of the arrival of the Mount Hood crew. The switchback lead here continues around the hillside and has been extended over the years to allow for up to 18 cars. At one time, a turntable was located at its end that was used to turn steam locomotives, ensuring they would keep the water over their crowns when climbing up the steep grade. 1639 rounds the curve as the engineer ensures a smooth and controlled descent into the switchback. In 2022, the Mount Hood Railroad would acquire the 1639, a GP9U, to replace the 2250 whose lease was expiring. Previously of the Bountiful Grain and Craig Mountain Railroad, or BGCM, based out of northwest Idaho, this unit began life as a GP9 with the Santa Fe, where it would be rebuilt before being sold off by successor BNSF. With the train clear of the switch, the conductor lines it for Hood River. Once on board, the crew continues the last leg of their journey back to Hood River and the Interchange. With a clear vantage point above the interchange west of the depot, we watch as the Mount Hood crew adds their cars to the loads from the day before. With the caboose already set over out of sight, here number 2250 is the power. Crew done for the day, the Dalles turn makes good time, running light power, seen passing through Mayer State Park. Arriving in Hood River, the UP crew lines themselves from the main line into the interchange and proceeds to collect the outbound loads. With Fred mounted, the conductor and switchman make their way back to the cab with a little help from the engineer. With their work done in Hood River, the turn highballs it back to the Dalles. And with their departure, we conclude part 1 of our film on the Mount Hood Railroad. We certainly hope that you have enjoyed our initial look at this scenic Oregon shortline. Be sure to subscribe for part 2 of this film and more content to come. And from all of us at Sidetracked, thank you.